Hi everyone, my name is Jelani and I am here to talk a little bit today about Juneteenth and the continued freedom struggle of black people in this country. It's important to talk about where we've been, some of the advancements we've made, as well as where we're going. And we're going to focus on the challenges of continued black subjugation and talk about some of the things we can do to help address it. Talk a little bit about that. It's very important for us to have this conversation because right now we're seeing more legislation to stop schools from talking about racism in the United States. During a pandemic with over 500,000 people who've died, an economic recession, breathtaking inequality, and people storming the Capitol, legislatures across this country are wasting time on cultural war nonsense instead of doing things to keep people from dying. So this lets us know that some people are just playing out of ideas about how to address real problems in the country. And that means that we need to talk about this more because there's something that's obviously threatening about it. So let's talk about Juneteenth and the freedom struggle. Now, we can't talk about Juneteenth without talking about slavery. Now, slave labor was sourced from Africa and it impacted indigenous people. And this was a different type of slavery. This is chattel slavery. And chattel slavery was different from slavery that was executed in other societies. So other societies like Greeks and Romans, they had slaves, but they had enslaved people, but they could maintain families. They could even maintain some level of dignity. So chattel slavery was different. There are about 15 to 20 million people transported into slavery through the Middle Passage. And about 15% of Middle passengers died in the transport. So 48% of slaves went to the enslaved people went to the Caribbean. 41% went to Brazil, South America, in particular Brazil, and 5% went to North America. So what helped fuel the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade? Well, it began because it was mainly designed to fuel the development of luxury commodities like sugar in the early 15th century. Now, sugar is something that's very difficult to manufacture. And slave labor was used to make the sugar commodities market feasible. I tell my students sometimes, hey, sugar is one of the worst things that ever happened to the black man, not only because of the slave trade, but also because its effects on health of people today. And this fueled the development of slave markets in Central America, South America, and the West Indies. So many of us know the history of slavery in the United States. We know about the slave labor, how people went unpaid for their work, the atrocities, the poor living conditions, rape of a lot of women, lynching of a lot of men. But we also know that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued on September 22nd, 1862. And this released roughly 3.5 million enslaved people from bondage on New Year's Day in 1863. So we're asking, what is Juneteenth? Well, this is a time where enslaved African Americans were not released in Galveston, Texas until June 9th, 1865. And slavery was officially abolished with ratification of the 13th Amendment. Now, the enslavement of people didn't necessarily end. In a lot of ways, it just transformed. So let me set the stage for you. Post-Civil War, the Southern economy was in ruins. And frankly, a lot of Southern whites, though owning plantations, did not have the agricultural know-how to actually farm the land. Additionally, this is a period of accelerating industrialization. So thus, Confederate states wanted to maintain cheap labor to force planting and harvesting of agriculture but also work on mining, building railroads, manufacturing steel, etc. And so as slavery was outlawed in the 13th Amendment, except in the case of a conviction of crime, Southern sheriffs and municipalities identified a workaround to maintain this black labor force and subjugation. So one way that they did this was through the convict leasing system. And this is when black people would be charged with arbitrary crimes, often misdemeanors, often very petty, and selling their labor to private interests. Now, a lot of these crimes were, again, petty in nature. So these were things like vagrancy, which could include not having a job or not appearing to have a job. This could include having free time during the day, selling products before sunrise or after sunset, gambling, disturbing public worship, bigamy, miscegenation, which is, basically marrying somebody outside your race, obscene language, talking loud in front of white women, or riding in an empty freight car. These are all things that could get someone arrested and put into a labor camp. And to do dangerous work like mining or a number of other industries where black people would not get paid or be paid. And so this was functional slavery, as the conditions of these camps were much like those of a plantation. There were poor living conditions, rampant disease, and poor provision of food and clothing. People were overworked and underfed. You could literally argue that chattel slavery continued in the U.S. through convict leasing up until the Second World War. So this system began around 1866, and by 1877, all former Confederate states except Virginia were participating in the convict leasing system. Now, keep in mind the role that laws played in this, as by 1866, all but 2 southern states passed anti-vagrancy laws. Mind you, the only people who were really prosecuted for this were black people. Additionally, by the 1880s, it was illegal for black men to change employers without permission. And in 1865, the law in Mississippi required African American workers to enter labor contracts with white farmers or risk arrest. This means that laws were developed in such a way to ensure that black people would be arrested whenever convenient for the state. So that means that thousands of black people went through this, literally thousands. And so, we can see how this is, we can see a modern day parallel with this, with prison privatization and prison labor. Okay, so since 2000, the number of people who are housed in private prisons has increased 33%, and incarcerated people earn between 86 cents to $3.45 per day, according to the Prison Policy Initiative. After emancipation, many terror tactics that were used by slave patrols were transferred to terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. What you have in front of you is an example of mob violence and lynching by whites. So since shortly before the emancipation, about 5,000 instances of mob murder by white people, mostly against blacks, although not exclusively, have been committed. And people were often killed because of a charge of rape against white women, although, as Ida B. Wells has shown us, a lot of times it was very consensual. People would be lynched for not giving up family members, or sometimes it would just be random bloodlust. So this happened, but it was met with vigorous resistance by people like Ida B. Wells and the NAACP. So this is a stain on the history that we really don't talk about as much. Let's continue talking about continued black subjugation in the Jim Crow era, although we fought bravely against this as well. And so this is something, so Jim Crow laws began during Reconstruction, and there were various state and local laws that promoted disenfranchisement of African Americans, having separate facilities, people not having access to jobs, and this is characterized by segregation and undermining of the social and economic mobility of African Americans. And it formally ended with laws like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and school desegregation. Right? Now, again, again, so again, so subjugation and slavery doesn't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily, or it hasn't necessarily gone away. In many ways, it's just alters into a less pernicious form. So to talk, and one way that this is being done now is mass incarceration, which in a lot of ways is fueled by policies like the war on drugs and some of these get tough on crime policies. So to talk about modern mass incarceration, we really have to understand the drug war. So again, let's set the context. Drug use for medicinal and recreational purposes has always been happening in the United States. I mean, they used to sell cocaine at Sears and Roebuck's. So while there have been some efforts to ban and regulate in the drugs in the 1800s, it's not like it is now. So this history dates back to the early 20th century in the work of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, who not only suppressed science to exaggerate the widespread danger of drug use. For example, they would say that a man on marijuana would would go killed his entire family, and they would publicize this in the news, but not make note of the fact that he had severe mental health challenges. But they also shape, this agency also helped shape a lot of how we think about drugs and how they worked hard to associate drug use with minority communities and aspects of cultures of minority communities, which we can see in some of these quotes here. So, for example, the leader of this bureau, Harry Anslinger, was really concerned about the popularity of jazz and blues music and their ability to bring black and white people together. And so there was this fear that they would lead to interracial partnerships, and so he targeted jazz singers, and that's why singers like Billie Holiday was repeatedly incarcerated. They targeted this woman for about 20 years, and and they had her chained on her deathbed. So it's literally trying to stop the music, but tying it to drug use. And so they were big about taking drug use out of the public health domain and stigmatizing it to hurt black, brown, and Asian communities. So let's fast forward several decades, and you can see beginning in the mid to late 70s, about early 80s, there was a rapid increase in the prison population, and a lot of this is due to the war on drugs and get tough on crime policies. And it started with Richard Nixon, who coined the term and created the DEA. But it appears that his interests may have been politically motivated. This is a quote from John Ehrlichman, who was a counsel to Richard Nixon, and he lets us know that Richard Nixon perceived that some of his political enemies were the anti-war left and black people. And by getting people to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, they were able to criminalize both and disrupt communities and put people in jail. And he also states that they were intentional about this and that they know they were being dishonest. There are other people in the Nixon administration who disputed this, but it is worth noting. All right. So this goes on for subsequent administrations. Jimmy Carter is kind of exempt because he actually decriminalizes marijuana to some extent. But everyone from Reagan to Trump, and yes, that includes to some extent Barack Obama, has contributed to this. And so the Anti-Drug Abuse Act established mandatory minimums. The 94 Crime Bill helped accelerate prison privatization, 3 strikes laws, and across the country, policing was accelerating and sentencing became harsher. And the scary thing, and many of you know this, is that drug use among black and white populations is essentially similar, and so is distribution. But black people have been going to jail for it more often. So our arrest rate for this is twice as high as whites, despite similar drug use. So despite this, we're still going, we're still fighting for freedom, showing our strength. This is our story, and there is reason to celebrate some of these hard-earned victories. But it's important for us to continue the fight. I've been Jelani, and thank you for your